There is a story most ambitious people tell themselves early in their careers. It goes something like this. If you work hard enough, if you become skilled enough, if you deliver results consistently enough, the right people will eventually notice. Success, in this version of the world, is a meritocracy. Talent rises. Excellence speaks for itself. The best person for the job gets the job. It is a comforting story. It is also, in most professional environments, dangerously incomplete. Consider two people at the same company, in the same department, with nearly identical technical abilities. One of them is quietly producing exceptional work, thorough, accurate, innovative. The other is producing work that is good, perhaps slightly less refined, but is consistently visible. This second person speaks up in meetings. They have a habit of framing their contributions in terms the leadership team cares about. They are known, not just to their immediate manager, but 2 and 3 levels up. When a high-visibility project becomes available, when a promotion discussion happens behind closed doors, when someone needs to be tapped for an opportunity that could reshape a career, which of these two people gets chosen? If your instinct is to say the first one, the quietly exceptional one, then you already understand the problem this audiobook is here to examine. Reputation is not vanity. It is not self-promotion in the shallow sense of the word. It is something far more structural, far more powerful, and far more consequential than most people realize until they've watched it work against them. Reputation is the invisible economy running parallel to every organization, every industry, every professional ecosystem on Earth. And like any economy, it rewards those who understand its rules and quietly punishes those who don't. The curious thing about this economy is that almost nobody teaches it explicitly. You can earn a degree in business, engineering, medicine, or law and emerge into your professional life having never once studied how human perception actually functions in high-stakes environments. You were taught what to produce. You were rarely taught how to ensure the right people understood what you were producing, why it mattered, and why you were the kind of person worth investing in. This is not a small gap. It is, for many talented people, the central reason their careers stall. Psychologists who study organizational behavior have long documented a phenomenon sometimes called the competence visibility gap. The basic idea is this: the skills required to do excellent work and the skills required to be perceived as doing excellent work are not the same skills. They overlap, certainly, but they diverge in ways that are both predictable and, once you see them, impossible to ignore. Think about what actually happens when a senior leader evaluates someone for advancement. They rarely have direct, granular visibility into that person's day-to-day work. They are making inferences. They are reading signals, the quality of someone's communication, the confidence with which they present their ideas, the ease with which they seem to move through complex situations, the way other respected people speak about them. These signals are not the work itself. They are the reputation of the work and of the person doing it. This is where the title of this audiobook becomes worth examining carefully. The idea that high performers invest in perception before skill is not an argument against skill. Skill is the foundation. It has to be real. It has to be substantive. But what the data on career trajectories consistently shows is that skill on its own has a ceiling. The people who break through that ceiling, who seem to accelerate while equally talented peers plateau, have almost always figured something out that the others haven't. They understand that reputation is not the reward for doing good work. Reputation is the infrastructure through which good work becomes opportunity. And infrastructure, unlike talent, is something you can deliberately build. Here is the central tension this audiobook will sit with. We live in a professional culture that romanticizes quiet excellence while systematically rewarding strategic visibility. We admire the person who lets their work speak for itself, but we promote the person who understood that work on its own rarely speaks loudly enough. This tension is real, and it creates genuine discomfort, because navigating it requires a kind of self-awareness that can feel, at first, uncomfortably calculated. But calculation is not inauthenticity. Awareness is not manipulation. And understanding the reputation economy is not about pretending to be something you're not. It is about ensuring that what you genuinely are, your capabilities, your values, your judgment, is actually legible to the people whose decisions shape your life. The question worth sitting with as we begin this journey is a simple one. Over the past year, the past 5 years, have you been investing as seriously in how you are perceived as you have in what you can do? For most people, honestly answered, the answer reveals exactly where the gap is. There is a moment that happens in almost every professional's career, usually somewhere between the 5 and 10-year mark, where something quietly shifts. The learning curve that once felt steep and energizing begins to flatten. The skills that took years to build are now largely built. And yet the career trajectory doesn't automatically accelerate the way it seemed like it would when those skills were still being developed. Something feels stuck. The work is good. The results are there. But the recognition, the opportunities, the advancement, they seem to be flowing toward other people. People who, from the inside, don't always appear to be working harder or thinking more clearly. What is happening in those moments is rarely about competence. It is almost always about perception. To understand why, it helps to look at how human beings actually make judgments about other human beings, particularly in professional contexts where the stakes are high and the information is incomplete. Because here is something that cognitive psychology has established quite firmly. When people evaluate others, they are not running careful, systematic analyses. They are, almost always, operating on heuristics, mental shortcuts, pattern recognition systems that evolved to make fast decisions with limited data. Daniel Kahneman's foundational work on thinking distinguished between 2 cognitive systems, one that operates quickly, automatically, and emotionally, and one that is slower, deliberate, and analytical. The insight that matters here is that the fast system does most of the actual work, even in situations where we believe we are being careful and rational. When a senior executive forms an impression of a colleague, when a hiring committee narrows a list, when a client decides who they trust with something important, the slow, analytical mind may ratify the decision, but the fast, intuitive mind almost always made it first. This matters enormously for anyone thinking seriously about reputation, because it means that the impressions people form of you are not primarily the result of careful evaluation. They are the result of signals, rapid, often unconscious signals, that your presence, your communication, and your behavior constantly emit. And those signals are being processed and catalogued long before any formal evaluation takes place. Consider what happens in a room where leadership is being discussed. A name comes up. Before anyone has consciously decided what they think about that person, a feeling has already formed. Maybe it's a vague sense of confidence, of reliability, of sharpness. Maybe it's something slightly less certain, a hesitation, a question mark. These feelings are not random. They are the accumulated residue of every interaction, every piece of communication, every moment of visibility or invisibility that person has left behind. Reputation, at its core, is what the room feels before it thinks. This is why the concept of letting your work speak for itself runs into such difficulty in real organizational environments. Work, as an artifact, is often invisible to the people whose opinions matter most. A beautifully executed analysis, a piece of code that prevents a system's failure, a negotiation handled with extraordinary skill, these things happen largely out of view. What travels upward through an organization is not the work itself, but the story of the work. And stories are told by people, shaped by relationships, colored by the reputations already attached to the names involved. Here is an observation that tends to make people uncomfortable when they first encounter it. In most professional environments, perception precedes reality. That is, the reputation someone carries into a room shapes how their actual performance in that room is interpreted. Research on what social psychologists call expectation confirmation bias shows that when we expect someone to be impressive, we tend to find evidence of impressiveness in what they do. When we expect mediocrity, we unconsciously filter for it. The same presentation, delivered by 2 different people with 2 different reputations, will be experienced differently by the same audience. This is not cynical. It is simply how human cognition operates under conditions of uncertainty, and professional environments are almost always conditions of uncertainty. What makes this particularly interesting and particularly actionable is that this dynamic is not fixed. Perceptions once formed do have a kind of stickiness, but they are not permanent, they are constructed, and what is constructed can be reconstructed. The people who understand this most clearly are the ones who stop treating their reputation as a byproduct of their work and start treating it as something that requires the same kind of deliberate attention they would give to any other high-value investment. There is a term used in behavioral economics, signal value, that describes the information content carried by a particular action or choice beyond its direct practical effect. In the reputation economy, almost everything a professional does carries signal value. The way you run a meeting signals something. The way you respond to criticism signals something. The relationships you cultivate signal something. The projects you associate yourself with signal something. The question is never whether you are sending signals. You always are. The question is whether you are sending them deliberately. And that question, it turns out, separates two very different kinds of careers. In the early 1980s, a young lawyer named Barack Obama arrived at Harvard Law School. He was not the most technically gifted student in his class. Harvard Law attracts exceptional minds from everywhere, and raw legal intellect was hardly in short supply. What distinguished Obama, by the accounts of those who knew him then, was something different. It was the way he listened, the way he made people on opposite sides of an argument feel genuinely heard before he offered a synthesis. The way he seemed to understand intuitively that influence in a room full of smart, competitive people does not come from dominating. It comes from being the person everyone trusts to hold the complexity without losing their footing. He became president of the Harvard Law Review, not because he was the best legal technician, because he had, whether consciously or not, understood something about reputation architecture that most of his peers were still figuring out. Reputation architecture is a phrase worth sitting with. Architecture implies design. It implies intentionality, the idea that something is being built according to a considered plan, not simply accumulated at random. And the most effective professionals, when you study them carefully, are almost always architects in this sense. They are not leaving their reputations to chance or to the slow accumulation of good work over time. They are making deliberate choices about the signals they send, the relationships they cultivate, the narratives that attach to their names. This does not mean they are inauthentic. That is the misunderstanding that tends to stop people from engaging seriously with this idea. Authenticity and intentionality are not opposites. An architect who designs a house is not being inauthentic about what a house is. They are simply ensuring that the house serves its purpose as effectively as possible. Reputation architecture operates on the same principle. The goal is not to construct a false image. The goal is to ensure that the genuine image, the real capabilities, the real values, the real judgment, is communicated clearly and consistently to the people who need to receive it. What do elite performers actually do differently? The first thing worth noticing is that they think in terms of associations. Reputation is never built in isolation. It is always built relative to other things, other people, other projects, other ideas. High performers are acutely aware of what their name is being associated with, and they make choices accordingly. They seek proximity to excellence, not as social climbing, but as a signal-sending strategy. Being in the room where important things are decided, working alongside people whose reputations are strong, volunteering for projects that carry prestige and visibility, these are not accidents, they are choices. The second thing elite performers do differently is that they invest heavily in what might be called narrative coherence. Their careers tell a story. When someone looks at their trajectory, the roles they've taken, the problems they've chosen to work on, the expertise they've developed, there is a through line, a logic, a sense that this person knows where they are going and has been moving deliberately toward it. This coherence is powerfully reassuring to the people who make consequential decisions about who to trust with important things. Incoherence, by contrast, a resume that zigs and zags without apparent purpose, creates a subtle but persistent uncertainty. Third, and perhaps most importantly, elite performers understand the relationship between consistency and credibility. Reputation is not built in moments of exceptional performance. It is built in moments of ordinary performance, and how consistently the ordinary is done well. Anyone can be impressive once. The person who is impressive in a boardroom and impressive in an email thread and impressive under pressure and impressive when no one important is watching, that person is building something that random exceptional moments never can. Consistency is reputation's foundation, and credibility is what consistency compounds into over time. There is a concept in social psychology called behavioral confirmation. The idea that once someone has a strong enough reputation in a particular direction, people around them begin to act in ways that reinforce it. If you are known as someone with exceptional judgment, people bring you harder problems. Harder problems give you more opportunities to demonstrate exceptional judgment. The reputation feeds the reality, and the reality feeds the reputation. It is a flywheel, and the people who understand this start spinning it deliberately, early. But here is the nuance that separates sophisticated reputation architects from people who are simply performing. The signals have to be grounded in something real. Reputation built on performance theater eventually collapses, often at the worst possible moment, when the stakes are highest and the scrutiny is greatest. The investment in perception only compounds when the underlying asset, the actual skill, the actual character, the actual judgment, is genuinely there. This is why the title of this audiobook is so precise in its language. High performers invest in perception and skill. The perception investment comes first in the sense that it must be built deliberately rather than left to chance. But skill is always the foundation it rests on. What elite performers have figured out is that these two things, skill and perception, are not in competition. They are in conversation. And learning to manage that conversation, rather than leaving it to chance, is one of the most leveraged professional investments a person can make. There is a particular kind of professional frustration that is almost never talked about openly, because it carries with it a faint whiff of bitterness that ambitious people don't like to admit to feeling. It goes something like this. You watch someone else, someone you know, someone whose work you have seen up close, receive recognition, opportunity, or advancement that you believe with genuine conviction should have gone to you or to someone more deserving. The work wasn't better, the thinking wasn't sharper, but something about that person made them more visible, more memorable, more present in the minds of the people who mattered. What you were watching in those moments was strategic visibility in action, and the discomfort it produces is worth examining, because buried inside that discomfort is one of the most important lessons a career can teach. Most talented people have a deeply ingrained belief that visibility and substance are inversely related, that the people who are loudest are rarely the deepest. That self-promotion is a kind of intellectual vulgarity, a signal almost of insecurity or mediocrity. This belief is not entirely wrong. There are certainly environments where performance theater substitutes for genuine contribution, and the results are usually mediocre at best and catastrophic at worst. But the belief becomes dangerous when it leads talented people to conclude that the solution is to disengage from visibility entirely, to keep their heads down, do the work, and trust that excellence will eventually be rewarded. The research on this is fairly consistent and fairly uncomfortable. In a study of managers across multiple industries, researchers found that visibility to senior leadership was a stronger predictor of promotion than performance ratings from direct supervisors. Not because senior leaders were irrational or unfair, but because promotion decisions are fundamentally predictions about future performance. And predictions are made based on available information. If a senior leader has limited direct exposure to your work, they are not in a position to make a confident prediction about your potential. They will default to the people they know, whose capabilities feel legible and whose judgment feels tested. This is the quiet tax that invisible excellence pays. It is not that the work goes unrewarded. It usually gets rewarded at the level where it is seen, but it rarely travels. It rarely compounds. It rarely opens the doors that transform a solid career into an exceptional one. So what does strategic visibility actually look like in practice for someone who finds self-promotion instinctively uncomfortable? This is where the distinction between visibility and performance becomes critical. The most effective form of professional visibility is not about drawing attention to yourself. It is about drawing attention to ideas, problems, and perspectives that happen to require your particular presence to articulate. There is a meaningful difference between saying, "Look at what I did," and saying, "Here is something I think matters, and here is why." The first is self-referential. The second is value-referential, and it positions you as a thinker rather than a self-promoter. The most influential professionals in any organization tend to be the ones who are associated with important questions, not just good answers. They are the people who surface a problem before anyone else recognized it as a problem, who frame a strategic choice in a way that makes the decision suddenly feel clearer, who ask the question in a meeting that shifts the entire direction of the conversation. These moments create what might be called cognitive anchoring. The people in the room remember not just what was said, but who said it, and that memory becomes a building block of reputation. There is also something worth understanding about the social dynamics of visibility, specifically the role of what organizational researchers call sponsors. Sponsors are different from mentors. A mentor gives you advice. A sponsor uses their own reputational capital to advocate for you in rooms you are not in. The distinction matters because the most important career decisions, the promotions, the assignments, the opportunities, are almost always made in rooms you are not in. What happens in those rooms depends almost entirely on whose name comes up, who says it, and what reputation that name carries when it lands. Elite performers understand that building a sponsorship network is not a social exercise. It is a reputational infrastructure project. Every relationship with someone who has organizational influence and direct visibility into your work is a potential channel through which your reputation can travel to places you cannot personally reach. This is why high performers invest so seriously in making their work legible, not just visible, but interpretable, to the people above and around them. Here is the principle underneath all of this. In any environment where decisions about people are made by people who have incomplete information, the ability to shape what information reaches them and how it is framed is a form of professional leverage. Not manipulation, leverage. The difference is that leverage amplifies what is genuinely there. It does not fabricate. The people who understand this stop thinking of visibility as something that happens to them, a byproduct of doing good work, and start thinking of it as something they architect, deliberately, consistently, with the same rigor they would bring to any other high-stakes professional discipline. And when they make that shift, something interesting tends to happen. The frustration of watching less talented people advance begins to fade, not because the world becomes fair, but because they stop leaving one of the most important variables in their career entirely to chance. There is an old idea in finance that most people understand intellectually, but very few actually feel in their bones until they have watched it work across decades. It is the idea of compounding, the principle that returns, reinvested consistently over time, generate not linear growth, but exponential growth. The numbers look unimpressive at first. Then at some point that is difficult to pinpoint precisely, they begin to look extraordinary. And the most striking thing about compounding, for anyone who studies it carefully, is not the size of the eventual returns. It is how long the process is invisible before it suddenly isn't. Reputational capital works on exactly the same principle, and most people massively underestimate this, both in terms of how powerful the compounding becomes over time and how catastrophically it can unwind when the underlying trust is damaged. Trust is the mechanism through which reputational capital accumulates, not likability, not charisma, not even competence in isolation, trust. And trust, in professional environments, is built from a very specific combination of ingredients that behavioral researchers have spent considerable effort mapping. The most useful framework, for our purposes, comes from work on what makes people perceived as credible in high-stakes organizational contexts. It essentially reduces to three things: The perception that you know what you are talking about, the perception that you will do what you say you will do, and the perception that your interests are not purely self-serving. Competence, reliability, and integrity, in that order and in that combination. What makes this framework interesting is what it implies about where reputations actually break down. Most professionals, when they think about reputation damage, think about dramatic failures, a public mistake, a visible ethical lapse, a high-profile project that collapses. And those things do damage reputations, sometimes severely. But the more common form of reputational erosion is far quieter and far more insidious. It happens through small, repeated signals that chip away at one of those three pillars without anyone explicitly noticing. Consider reliability. In most professional environments, there is a kind of background tracking happening, largely unconscious, of whether people do what they say they will do. Deadlines that slip without communication. Commitments made in meetings that quietly disappear. Follow-through that is inconsistent in ways that are individually easy to explain away, but cumulatively create a pattern. No single instance is damning, but over time, the pattern calcifies into a perception. And once that perception exists, once someone is known, even subtly, as someone whose word requires verification, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. The absence of trust, once established, is sticky in ways that competence alone cannot dissolve. This is one of the least discussed dynamics in professional environments, the asymmetry between building trust and losing it. Trust accumulates slowly through consistent behavior across many interactions over extended periods of time. It can be damaged quickly, sometimes in a single moment, if that moment is consequential enough and visible enough. And the repair, when repair is possible at all, takes far longer than the original construction did. This asymmetry is not merely unfair. It is, from the perspective of evolutionary psychology, entirely rational. In environments where cooperation matters and betrayal is costly, the ability to rapidly downgrade trust in an unreliable actor is a survival advantage. Human beings are wired to detect and remember untrustworthiness with particular efficiency. For the ambitious professional, this asymmetry has a very practical implication. Protecting reputational capital is not a defensive activity. It is a high-return investment. Every time you over-deliver on a commitment, every time you communicate proactively when something isn't going to plan, every time you handle a difficult situation with more integrity than the situation strictly required, you are making a deposit into a ledger that accumulates interest over years and decades. And every time you cut corners on visibility, rationalize a minor inconsistency, or treat a small commitment as unimportant, you are making a withdrawal that costs more than its face value. There is a concept that sociologists call social capital, the accumulated value stored in relationships and networks that can be drawn on when needed. Reputational capital is a closely related but distinct idea. Where social capital lives in your relationships, reputational capital lives in other people's minds, in the impressions, associations, and expectations they carry about you into every context where your name comes up. It is, in a sense, a distributed asset. You cannot hold it directly, you can only tend it through consistent behavior over time. The most sophisticated professionals understand something about this distributed nature that changes how they think about every interaction. They understand that reputation travels through networks in ways that are often invisible to the person whose reputation it is. A conversation between two senior leaders about a third person's readiness for a significant role, that conversation is happening without the third person present, drawing on impressions accumulated across dozens of interactions, many of which that person may not even remember. The reputation that exists in those two leaders' minds was built not in one decisive moment, but in the long, quiet accumulation of signals sent over months and years. This is why the professionals who take reputation most seriously tend to be unusually consistent in how they show up, not just in high-visibility moments, but in every interaction, regardless of who is watching. They have internalized the understanding that reputation is not built in the spotlight. It is built in the aggregate of everything that happens outside it. And that understanding, once genuinely absorbed, changes not just how you work, it changes how you think about what work is for. There is something uniquely challenging about building a reputation in the current professional moment that deserves to be named directly. The environment in which careers now unfold is one where information travels faster than at any point in human history, where professional identities are increasingly public and searchable, and where the gap between a perception formed and a perception spread has collapsed almost entirely. A single interaction, a poorly handled conflict, an ill-timed comment, a moment of poor judgment in a semi-public context can travel through a professional network in hours in a way that would have taken months or years in an earlier era. This acceleration cuts both ways. Positive reputations can travel faster too. Exceptional work, when it finds the right audience in the right moment, can establish someone standing in a field faster than was previously possible. But the asymmetry we discussed in the last section, the fact that trust is lost faster than it is built, means that the acceleration of the information environment tends to amplify risk more than it amplifies opportunity. The downside moves faster than the upside, and the upside requires more consistent, sustained effort to produce. Understanding this changes how the wisest professionals think about reputation management in the modern context. They do not think of it as a crisis response discipline, something you engage with when something has gone wrong. They think of it as an ongoing practice, as continuous and as non-negotiable as the work itself. And within that practice, a few principles tend to separate the people who navigate this environment well from the people who find themselves repeatedly surprised by how quickly perception can shift. The first principle is what might be called long-game thinking in a short attention world. The temptation in an environment of rapid information flow is to optimize for the immediate, to chase the visible win, the quick recognition, the signal that produces a response right now. This temptation is understandable, but it tends to produce careers that are episodically impressive and structurally fragile. The professionals who build the most durable reputations are the ones who consistently make choices that favor long-term credibility over short-term visibility. They pass on opportunities that would generate attention but compromise their integrity. They invest in relationships that may not yield anything for years. They build expertise in areas that feel less fashionable but more foundational. They are playing a different game than the people around them, and the difference only becomes fully legible over time. The second principle is the discipline of reputation repair, because in any career of meaningful length and ambition, something will go wrong. A project will fail publicly. A relationship will fracture in a way that sends damaging signals. A judgment call will look, in retrospect, clearly mistaken. The people who handle these moments well share a common characteristic. They do not attempt to minimize, redirect, or outrun the damage. They move toward it. They acknowledge what happened with clarity and without excessive self-flagellation. They demonstrate, through their response, exactly the qualities that the failure appeared to call into question: judgment, accountability, resilience. The response to failure, handled well, can paradoxically strengthen a reputation in ways that uninterrupted success never could, because it answers a question that success leaves open. What does this person do when things go wrong? The third principle is perhaps the most counterintuitive, and it has to do with generosity as a reputation strategy. In environments where reputation is a form of currency, the instinct can be to hoard, to protect credit, to guard expertise, to be careful about who benefits from your effort and your network. This instinct is natural, but it is strategically backwards. The professionals with the strongest reputations in almost every field tend to be notably generous, with their knowledge, their introductions, their recognition of others' contributions. This generosity is not naive. It is structurally intelligent. Every time you make someone else look good, every time you share credit more broadly than you strictly had to, every time you invest in someone else's development without an obvious return, you are sending a signal about character that travels further and sticks longer than almost any display of individual competence. This is because character signals operate differently from competence signals in the minds of observers. Competence impresses, character reassures. And in the high-stakes professional decisions that define careers, Who gets trusted with the important thing? Who gets brought into the inner circle? Who gets the benefit of the doubt when something is uncertain? Reassurance is often more valuable than impression. There is a final observation worth making as this audiobook draws toward its close. The reputation economy is not a game that is won or lost at any single point. It is an ongoing relationship between who you genuinely are, how consistently you express that in your behavior, and how clearly that expression is communicated to the people whose perception of you shapes your world. The investment is never finished, the ledger is always open, and the returns, like all compounding returns, are heavily weighted toward those who start early, stay consistent, and think in decades rather than quarters. The most important shift this understanding asks of you is not a tactical one. It is not about learning a new set of behaviors or adopting a new professional persona. It is something quieter and more fundamental, a change in how you think about what you are actually building, every day, through every interaction, in every room you enter, and every room where your name comes up in your absence. You are not just building a career, you are building a reputation. And in the long run, for the ambitious and the serious and the genuinely talented, that reputation is the career. The journey of understanding reputation is, in many ways, a journey toward a more honest relationship with how the professional world actually works. Not as we wish it were, but as it genuinely is. Skill matters deeply. Character matters more. Consistency over time matters most of all. What this audiobook has tried to offer is not a set of tactics for managing impressions, but a framework for thinking about the invisible economy that runs beneath every organization, every industry, every professional relationship. The people who thrive in the long run are rarely the ones who were the most talented at the starting line. They are the ones who understood, earlier than most, that perception and reality are not opposites, they are partners. And that managing that partnership with integrity and with intention is one of the most sophisticated and most rewarding things a professional mind can do. Carry that understanding forward. Let it inform not just how you work, but how you show up. Because in the reputation economy, how you show up is ultimately everything.